When someone thinks of a satanic cult, they normally think of a bunch of people dressed in robes, maybe sacrificing a goat or two every so often over a pentagram lit with candles in order for the members to keep Satan happy maybe? Maybe writing on some old paper some symbols or sigils written in one's blood that came from a pinprick of a finger. This is what I believe to be what news, media and hearsay often portrays of what an average Satanist would look like. From what I have gathered over the years, I understand that Satanists come in all shapes and forms, with many different subsections and practices within its domain. I believe Satanism to be somewhat of a blanket term, where many different subsections of Satanism exist, with many different beliefs both similar or contradictory between the different types of Satanism. You have some who worship an existential god or gods, demons even. In some categories of Satanism, they class themselves as atheists and rather respect the satanic symbolism in a way that is more of a quote middle finger to religious ideologies. Some examples of Satanists are the Church of Satan, the Satanic Temple, the Satanic Reds, just to name a few, and they all differ very much from each other. However, when I picture a Satanist, I don't picture them to be in a very small Welsh village that manage a satanic sex ring cult to get slaves to do their bidding. This is what happened to the small village of Kidwelly in Wales. Colin Batley was a man who lived in London until the 1990s, where him and 3 other women in the cult moved into a small cul-de-sac called Closure Onan in the village of Kidwelly, Wales. The village of Kidwelly had a low crime rate and was often considered to be a safe, kind community who looked out for each other. It had that small village feel of everyone knowing each other's business, like you get in most small towns and villages. One neighbour who lived a few doors down from Colin described the village as such a lovely area and the kind of place where you can leave property outside and your car unlocked. However, what the people of Kidwelly didn't know was that evil had come upon their small, quiet, safe place. Colin Batley became a security guard for a well-known grocery store. His wife, Eileen Batley, Jacqueline Marlin, and Shelley Miller were main members of the cult alongside their children. They were often seen as outsiders and kept themselves to themselves for a long time. Not many people knew about them for years to come, even in the small village. Colin was later described by neighbours as being an evil bully, with a torn Ragged England flag that was pinned on the outside of his home. He also had 2 Rottweiler dogs, one named Sekhet after the Egyptian lion goddess, and one named Toots after Tutankhamun. Whenever there was a knock on the door or noise outside, these 2 Rottweilers would jump at the front door, and Bailey actually trained them to be vicious. So you can understand why people didn't want to go to his house. Most of the members lived on the same street, with Jacqueline living next door to Colin and Elaine. Colin even knocked down the backyard fence that separated Jacqueline's and Colin's fence so the garden behind would actually become one. Colin has 2 sons and a daughter. Jacqueline Marlin was the mother of a daughter and victim who goes under the pseudonym Annabelle Forrest. Annabelle actually written an autobiography called The Devil on the Doorstep, and it entails the story of her life inside the cult, her childhood, moving to Kidwelly, and all the events that happened there. This was a hard, powerful, chilling read that goes in depth to exactly what happened. So I'm going to be referencing a fair bit of knowledge from this book, and I'm also going to be referencing some knowledge from like local news articles and mainstream media. However, the thing is that with this case, there's not a lot of media coverage, so you'll be seeing more of me and less pictures of the incident because there's hardly any pictures or video footage of this case. So let's jump straight into it. Colin's house had a lot of symbolic pictures of Egyptian gods that hung up on the walls. Several of these included one picture of Tutankhamun, and 2 pictures of people in white robes with the face of dogs or birds' heads, with hieroglyphs all over them. It was these exact pictures that were also hung on the walls of all the other members' houses. All the women in the cult had tattoos of Egyptian ankhs on them. In Egypt, ankhs were considered the symbol of life. Women also had tattoos of Eye of Hours, which apparently meant they were protected. The tattoos weren't exactly identical though, and a few were different colours. Apparently the colours represented, quote, rankings within the occult. They also wore upside down crosses across their necks. Anne said the cult was called the Church of BPH, although nobody ever knew what that meant. As far as I'm aware of, there's no other way to find out what that actually meant. Apparently, in the court hearings, they all denied being in the cult. Apparently, they also used to tell the children of the cult that they used to be, quote, Mormons, or like Mormons, should I say. Which is obviously fake because the differences between them were massive. Annabelle reckoned this was a decoy in order for the children to understand why they had to be so secretive. Even though Mormons ain't exactly as secretive as this cult was. The high priest Colin decided to tell its members not to mingle with outsiders, and it was the utmost importance to keep the religion a secret. So apparently the cult actually started before Wales, but it wasn't until Jacqueline and one other cult member, when they moved to Wales alongside Colin and Elaine, that's when things started to get more serious with all the rituals and meetings and demands that were put in place by Colin. One was a Thanksgiving ritual that happened every few months. There would be a table draped in purple cloth with a silver candlestick on it, a silver plate and wine-soaked bread, with a silver goblet filled with red wine. So this is where Colin would reside, standing right in front of the table, facing the Egyptian god picture that was hung up on the wall. Behind Colin was 16 different cult members, all with different colour robes on, all lined out in a way to represent a pyramid-like formation in the room. They wore different colour robes because the colours represented different rankings within the cult. For example, the children were mostly dressed in light blue, the adults were mostly in dark purple. The people would go up to the table one by one and take a sip of wine under Colin's instruction, and then they would head back to their position in the pyramid. All the while this was happening, Colin was quoting scriptures from the Aleister Crowley book, The Book of Law. Aleister Crowley was an English occultist, ceremonial magician, poet, novelist, mountaineer, and painter. The British popular press deemed this guy as the wickedest man in the world. He was often known performing sacrifices and rituals. I won't get into too much depth into Aleister Crowley, I'll save that for another video. But just for the context of the video, I wanted to give you a brief insight. This guy was deemed as one bad Satanist. Some people actually don't redeem him as a Satanist and rather just an occultist. Some do. There's actually a religion based on Aleister Crowley's teachings. Colin was known to perform tests on his followers. One of these tests were to perform sex acts on Colin. There was a time where Colin was in Jacqueline's house. Colin had told Jacqueline that he was going to spruce up and decorate her house as it was very run down. So as he was decorating, he made Jacqueline leave the house and for Annabelle, Jacqueline's daughter, to stay at home in her bedroom. Annabelle was always wary and scared of Colin, so she pretended to be asleep while in her room. She reported him calling her outside the bedroom to speak to her, so she left her room to be greeted with Colin on a stepladder putting up wallpaper over the already existing run-down wallpaper that was already peeling off the walls. She reported him saying to her,
"You know, the gods are pleased with you, Annabelle. They talk to me, tell me things. As the prince priest, I communicate with them directly, and they tell me that you are the one of the protected ones. You are special."
He continues,
"You know, Anna, it's vital that you exercise nothing but pure will in your life. Will is all that matters. All that matters. Everything else is a restriction and will bring you nothing but eternal pain, a gateway into the abyss. You hear people talking about sin, about modesty and chastity, about avoiding sin and impurity. Rubbish. It's all rubbish. The idea of sin is restriction, a restriction of purity and will. And if you are restricted in your will, then you will never reach the palace. Understand this, Annabelle. There is nothing called sin in our church. No restrictions. There is nothing but love. Love is law. Love under will. Sin is a construct of man to inhibit nature, to obstruct our true path. And if you wish to reach the palace and not be sucked into the void of the abyss, an eternity with pain without end, a lifetime of suffering, then you must obey your will and reject the notion of sin. These are the 4 gates to the palace, as you well know, and to pass through these gates, you must have risen within the church to a higher realm, to become a priestess. And the only way to do this is to exercise your pure will, to find your true path.
He went on and on for about an hour with this cult babble, basically saying what he just said, that apparently there's no such thing as sin, and that you basically have to do what you want to please the gods, and that if you do not do what you want, even if you believe it to be wrong, you will be punished forever in what they basically believe to be their version of hell. An hour had passed, and he hung up one sheet of wallpaper on the wall. That's when he got down on the stepladder and went into Jacqueline's bedroom and demanded that Annabelle followed him. To cut the story short, he basically had his way with Annabelle. Annabelle didn't have much choice in the matter because she was brainwashed for years into thinking that she had to do what Colin said as the quote, high priest, unquote, to please the gods and not end up in eternal pain and suffering in the abyss. Annabelle, amongst the rest of the group, had to do what he said all of the time. Annabelle was scared of what he was doing to her, but she was also scared of what might happen if she didn't do what he said. Annabelle was 11 years old when this incident happened. Colin was an evil, sick, twisted pedophile and rapist that used all the manipulation tactics that one could to control a victim. He scared people with the fear of the abyss. And to be honest, he just scared people by himself. I mean, the guy was an intimidating man. He was 6'4", tall and stocky with a high sensitive temper that would just snap at a moment's notice, putting people on edge and high alert, making sure that people would constantly seek to please him. He was also known to randomly go up to people in his home and dive towards them with his palm up in the air. And in them moments, he would strike towards them with an open palm, just for him to stop inches away from the face, often watching them retreat or cower in fear, victims thinking that they were just about to be struck. And he would just laugh at them, play it off and laugh. Apparently, he would always get a good kick out of this. 3 years later, and Jacqueline became pregnant. Jacqueline had an ex-boyfriend called Alan who used to live together when they were back in London. However, when they moved up, they often seen each other briefly. He came up a few times for the first few weeks when they moved to Wales, and apparently he was even a part of the cult for a very short time. However, the visits became less and less to the point where they became non-existent. Everyone in the cult started to talk about how Alan must have mysteriously and secretively came up and hooked up with Jacqueline. Therefore, the baby must be his. However, Jacqueline and Annabelle both knew the baby belonged to Colin. At this point, both Jacqueline and Annabelle were both having sex with Colin at the time, individually and sadly, sometimes together as a threesome. Annabelle knew the baby was his. Bear in mind that Colin and Elaine had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter was called Hope. Hope was a year older than Annabelle. Annabelle and Hope always got along with each other. Growing up together in their households, they often spent a lot of time with each other and they often compared themselves as sisters, especially seeing as alongside all the other cult members not being able to hang around with other school children and also not being able to participate in any after school clubs or go to any other friends' houses after school or even to make friends for that matter. Shortly after Jacqueline became pregnant, Elaine and Hope distanced themselves away from Jacqueline and Annabelle. They'd grown suspicious that Jacqueline's baby actually belonged to Colin, but obviously nobody could say anything when it came to bad talk about Colin. However, suspicion grew even more when Jacqueline had her baby, Moses. The name Moses was actually a nickname for him, as his name was really Amos. which actually stood for the Son of God in Egyptian. As a result, people's suspicion of Moses being Colin's grew. Close to this time, Colin actually forced Annabelle into a relationship with one of the other cult members' sons called Thomas. Thomas was 19, Annabelle at the time was 14. A few months later, they eventually broke up because apparently Thomas had told Colin that, quote, she doesn't even talk to me or even kiss me. Colin had told Annabelle angrily that the relationship between them were over and that she has to, quote, do better, basically warning her that she's ruining the church and, quote, displeasing the gods, unquote, amongst a load of other manipulative blabber, basically. So basically, as a result, she was ordered to be more happy. And with that, eventually they got back together. Or should I say, Colin made them get back together. All the while this was happening, Colin was still abusing Annabelle throughout her teen years. Over the years, Colin started to become bored with the rituals and had Jacqueline and some of the other cult members, such as Elaine and others, take over with the running of the church, while he took more of a backseat approach. By the time Annabelle was 17, she became pregnant. Colin had told everyone it was Thomas's. However, Thomas always wore a condom, so that was in fact a lie. Annabelle and Colin knew it was Colin's. In fact, Colin said to Annabelle, "This is a child from the gods," forcing to keep the baby, accusing Annabelle of being a murderer if she was going to go through with an abortion, which she originally wanted to do. It caused Annabelle a great deal of stress when she was pregnant, as the thought of bringing up a baby into this cult world was too much for her to bear. However, she was basically manipulated and forced to keep the baby. Again, she was 17 at the time. So Colin went around and manipulated the situation so that everyone believed that Annabelle and Thomas were having a baby together, when in fact, Colin and Annabelle both knew the baby belonged to him. Apparently, when she told her mum she was pregnant, her mum said, quote, she knew, unquote, and that, quote, maybe you should have kept your legs closed. Which is actually insane. Her mum was a cold, callous, sharp woman. Jacqueline never showed any form of affection and didn't even really look after her kids. In fact, it was Annabelle who looked after her little sister and her little brother. Annabelle basically raised these children. She seemed just cold at first, but by the time Annabelle was 8, Annabelle had to basically fend for herself, feed herself, clean herself, basically her own carer from the age of 8. Her mum would do the washing and feed her dinner, but that was as far as it went. By the time she was 14, that actually stopped, and her mum never talked to her from that point onwards. Annabelle actually became scared of talking to her because she was just so blank, but then she would snap at a moment's notice if something got on her nerves. A few months after Annabelle gave birth to the baby, Colin forced Annabelle into working as a prostitute. Annabelle worked in a brothel in Bristol, UK, at the long weekends. This was so she could become the, quote, whore of Babylon, unquote. This was considered a great achievement at the highest level of spiritual awakening, or spiritual greatness, as Colin would explain to these women. There were milestones put in place to achieve this level of greatness. 318, 618, and 918. This meant that women had to sleep with 1,854 men to achieve that spiritual milestone, with each milestone gaining a higher level. The thing is with this, though, is that Annabelle actually realised something. Months in, Annabelle realised that Jacqueline had achieved this highest milestone, but apparently she had to continue working for Colin, even though he always said that you could stop once you achieved spiritual greatness. Anna became more and more angry with Colin. Her trust in him was already at an all-time low, and when he sent her to work, she went into a very dark place, where at first she felt like there was no escape. But then, that anger turned into frustration of having to leave her baby in the care of Colin and his family. She needed to do something about it. So throughout that year, she came up with a plan to escape. However, it wasn't all that easy. Colin made her to believe that the outside world was a scary place, and that the gods were constantly watching. The gods would even curse her if she dared strayed into the outside world. Outside the church, she was told, from a very young age, and throughout her whole time in the cult. But this didn't stop her from putting money aside from what she made. She was making Colin over £3,000 every week over the 3 days. This was because, as previously mentioned, everyone had to give Colin their wages. He would then, quote, redistribute it throughout the church, including sending some to the so-called headquarters in France that was conveniently sworn under church secrecy. Therefore, no one knew much about this headquarters in France. Annabelle decided to take £20 to £30 out of her own wages on the sly, hiding it in a small college beauty suitcase, planning her escape over the next few months. She decided to confide in to Thomas, her so-called boyfriend at the time. Again, remember, this was a forced relationship. Thomas was actually also growing increasingly impatient with Colin and how the church was being ran. With her knowing no one else inside the church, she was struggling to think of a place to stay. However, she heard on the passing of a thing called Facebook and asked Thomas if he could go into the library on the way to or from his work to find Alan, Jacqueline's ex, who was actually like a father figure in Annabelle's life before he got shunned away from the church. Lo and behold, Alan responded and more than kindly offered to pick them up and for them to stay at his house. They made a plan to escape and a ride was arranged with Alan in the middle of the night. However, the night before the planned escape, the thought got too much for Annabelle, who ordered Thomas to cancel the plan. Again, she felt stuck, frustrated at herself for the fact that she felt trapped and that she had given up on her maybe only a chance to escape. It wasn't soon after that she got back on track and planned for an escape route again, this time with more money to survive off for if she did escape, which made her feel more secure with the aftermath of the escape. And it was on one night, May 2:30 AM, she got up out of bed and made her escape. So yeah, Annabelle actually made a plan with Alan again and she managed to be a free woman, thank God. Now, Annabelle actually found it hard to adjust to normal life outside the cult. She was a victim of severe brainwashing over the years, stemming from when she was a child. She was 7 when Colin came into her life. It wasn't until she casually said to Alan, and in the future, her aunties, what had happened to her. It wasn't until she began to explain what had happened to her, she began to realise the severity of the abuse she had been put through. It was watching other people's reactions to the things that she'd been put through that were just a part of her life. She began to realise just how bad things were. She knew she hated her life at the time in the cult, and she knew these things made her mad or sad, and she even knew some things were wrong. But she didn't view herself as a victim. She would explain to her family that Colin gave her a choice in these things. Although Colin would always say it would make the gods angry if she didn't do what he said. Therefore, she always felt like she needed to do it anyway, even if it was her own choice. It wasn't until leaving the cult she realised that she was a victim of systemic manipulative abuse, amongst many other abuse. She had time to grieve and process all this information. She had many bumps along the road with alcoholism and drug abuse and so forth. However, her family, her aunties, and their partners managed to get her back on track. And her bump didn't last long until she finally came to terms with the grief and she got sober and continued that journey and coming to terms with the abuse and acknowledging it. And as a result, she would end up reporting all of what happened to her to the police close to about a year after she escaped the Kidwelly cult. When she reported this to the police, an investigation went underway. And funny enough, a few more victims started to come forward around this time. These victims were under court-ordered anonymous protection. One case was about a person who was forced to have sex with Elaine, Colin's wife. Another, sadly, was a 15-year-old girl who was forced to have sex with Colin and was passed around the church. February 2011 was the date of the first trials, and all 4, Colin, Jacqueline, Elaine and Shelley, were up on trial. Judge Paul Thomas QC was the judge working on the trial. Annabelle proceeded to give evidence via video link in another room. They denied almost all accusations made against them. They denied even being in a cult. Colin denied hardly reading, never mind enjoying or quoting Aleister Crowley, the Book of Law, saying that, quote, I tried reading it, but I wasn't a fan, and that I'm currently a Mormon and read the Bible. The only things that Colin didn't deny were the accusations that were impossible for him to hide from. For example, the police did a DNA test to confirm that Emily was indeed Colin's daughter, so he had to admit that he had sex with her, but apparently only on 2 occasions. This was an insanely false fact, and he abused many kids and adults alike for many years. Moses, Jacqueline's son, was also confirmed to be Colin's son. Apparently, this was the news to Elaine, and it was obvious her anger and disgust in Colin inside the courtroom. Elaine proceeded to stand trial and say that she had plans to leave Colin before the police came to her. She was quoted saying that, I'm embarrassed to be married to him. Judge Thomas QC said at the end of the trial, you formed a community within a community. You were described as evil. That, in my view, is an entirely accurate statement of your character. He also added, it is likely that you have dedicated your life since you were 12 years old to satisfying your sexual urges by whatever means at your disposal. Colin was charged with 35 offences that included 11 counts of rape, 3 counts of indecent assault, causing a minor to have sex, buggery, 12 counts of possessing imagery of underage girls. He was given 11 years minimum recommendation. The judge said that this means that you might never get released from jail. Jacqueline was given 12 years, aiding and abetting rape, organising prostitution for a profit, persuading a child to participate in sexual activity, indecency with a child, 3 counts. Elaine Batley got 3 counts of indecency with a child and sex acts with a child with an 8-year sentence. Shelley Miller got 5 years for indecent activity with a child and persuading a child to participate in sexual activity. A policeman said the offences were committed against a background of persistent psychological coercion and fear of using the vehicle of the occult. The victims were brainwashed, frightened. They felt they had no choice. Trial Judge Paul Thomas QC offered the jury counselling if they needed it, seeing as the case was so bad. And there we have it, the case of Colin Batley and his satanic cult. So these are just going to be the final thoughts on the matter. I'll be honest with you, this video took me a long time to do, way longer than it actually should have taken. This was because I did a fair bit of research, as much as I possibly could, into it. I read Annabelle's book. I looked at as many news articles as they were out there. Again, there's a fair few news articles, but not many pictures or media, or not too much to say on the matter. A lot of the media kind of repeated each other, mainly to do with the court cases itself. I just thought I wanted to report this because when I first went into the story, at first, I just thought it sounded so obscure. The idea of a satanic cult in a small little town in Wales, it just kind of baffled my brain. You don't really picture a satanic cult in a small village. I guess in my head, I don't know, you're picturing, yeah, maybe small town suburbs, but maybe a lot more popular than out in the sticks or middle of nowhere kind of place, you know? And so it kind of sparked my interest of the obscurity of it. And it actually wasn't until I started delving more. I was writing the script and then I started reading the book. And then I didn't realize how bad this case got. And to be honest, I was thinking of not actually doing it. I thought it was too dark almost. There's a lot of things I've not described as well, which I've purposefully left out, which is all explained in the book, which I recommend you give a read if you want to know more information about the case. But yeah, I found it hard to write and I found it hard to edit this video because of exactly that. I don't know if I'm sure you'll notice that a lot of my videos, actual video footage of me in between, I'm very dressed differently. That's because I was doing these video bits in parts throughout the period of, I want to say, 6 or 7 weeks. Again, it took me way longer just because I struggled writing about it. I struggled reporting it. Yeah, it was a difficult case. But I felt like I needed to tell it as well because I wanted to do Annabelle justice. I think that woman is an amazing woman, and you know the power she has, the power to her, man, because that is one strong cookie. I just wanted to expose Colin Batley for awful, awful person that he is. I felt like that was important to get Annabelle's story across. This case also taught me a lot about how victims can blame themselves for the events that happened. The fact that, again, towards the end, yeah, Annabelle was explaining how she felt that the things that happened to her were a choice, when in reality they weren't a choice. And it was so shocking to hear. In the book, she tells you specifically and in detail about the reactions that people had. Again, she was telling her story of what Colin did to her, and people were in tears. Alan was in tears, breaking down in front of her, and she was confused. She was genuinely confused at first at his reaction, and that really stood out to me. I learned something. I'd really learned something there. Jacqueline also confused me. At first, going into this, I felt like she was a victim. I felt like she was a victim of manipulative abuse and amongst many other things. However, as I started reading more and more into it, and even Annabelle herself described her as she is just an evil woman. She was very mentally aware of everything that was happening. She just didn't care. She didn't care. She was just madly in love with Colin. That's something that Annabelle says in the book as well. Like, she was madly in love with Colin and she would do anything for him. And as a result, she would do awful things and say awful things and be an awful, awful mother, as well as an awful person. At the end of the book, Annabelle says that she's doing well and that she continues to struggle at times with certain situations where it will bring up the past, and also she's also adjusting to normal life still in a way where she says she struggles doing day-to-day chores. Having all this freedom now is sometimes overwhelming for her. For example, she now has a partner of many years, and she admitted that when he gives her an option like, what would you like for dinner? Something as simple as that. She said it can be unbelievably overwhelming for her, and she gets deep anxiety about making simple life choices because she never had that freedom of choice ever in her life. And it was really powerful. I felt that was something to hear. Anyway, with that, I'll stop with my ranting. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope I did the victims and Annabelle well by telling this story. I truly do. I hope I did her justice in exposing what a vile person Colin Batley is. But yeah, thank you for watching, guys. Remember, take care and stay safe.